Welcome everyone to another episode of Kiwi Talks. My guest today is a programming and engineering guru. He's worked on video games such as Recore, Batman Arkham Origins, Blackgate, and of course the beloved Metroid Prime Trilogy. I'd like to welcome the great Jack Mathews. How you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. The great Jack Mathews is my father's name. You can just call me Jack.
And I do have to say I love your plaques. They are awesome.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Got the Prime games right there. Batman Arkham Origins Blackgate, Metal Gear Solid Vita, and Shadow of the Colossus remake that I helped Bluepoint with.
That's so cool. Quite the resume.
Thanks.
So the first question I have, well, it's kind of a statement at the same time, but obviously the Metroid Prime Trilogy games are technical marvels, right? I mean, I used to speedrun those games up until I saw my Wii U, and I can't remember a time, if ever, where the frame rate dropped below 60 frames per second. Like, how in the world did you pull that off? Like, just keeping that consistent frame rate?
Well, one was that since we were on the GameCube, we kind of knew what our limitations were, right? And it was really, I mean, step one was looking at the hardware and looking at its capabilities and seeing what we could use, what we couldn't use, and working from there. So, like, for instance, the GameCube at the time had bump mapping. Bump mapping was a big deal back then, you know, sort of like the precursor to normal maps now. But I actually elected not to use bump mapping at all in the Metroid games. I found that while it created a nice look a lot of the time, it also didn't work very well with a static lighting model, which is what we use for all our lighting. And it took a ton of performance. And I just thought, like, bang for buck, it wasn't going to work out very well. So instead of using that, and instead of using something called specular lighting, I actually just elected to use a couple of texture passes for essentially reflection based on not position at all, just based on surface normal, and which surface normal is like the angle of the surface. So instead of like bouncing the light from a certain place, just literally like always projecting a sphere based on that angle. And then we had a little mask that was like called reflectivity. And by doing those two things, we're able to get a decent amount of the way there in terms of the look, but we saved a ton of performance. You know, like Michael Abrash in one of his books, Michael Abrash was one of the geniuses at id Software that did a lot of the underpinning technology for Quake and stuff like that. You know, he said something that was something that I always remembered, which is basically that when you're optimizing, don't optimize for the best case, optimize for the worst case. And so that's really what I tried to do. And so on the technology side of things, I always tried to make sure that no matter what, everyone was operating under similar performance profiles. So pretty much like everything on the screen used very similar shading models and very similar things, so that if somewhere was going to drop 30, a lot of places are going to drop to 30. So that was like step one, was basically finding the limits and finding the pieces that we were going to use of the hardware and being very disciplined of not using other pieces. Step two was really just writing on the art staff and the art and putting the tools in place so that when people were playing the game and frame rates were dropped, it was like a catastrophic failure. Like for a lot of the debug builds, we actually had it where it would like print a bunch of text in the middle of the screen for like a full second if a frame or two got dropped, of like 30 FPS, 30 FPS, 30 FPS, you know, to just really remind everybody and essentially make it fail a test pass if things started dropping too much. So that's what we sort of did on the GPU side. And on the CPU side, again, we just tried to keep very, very disciplined, very in place, and always made 60 FPS the one thing we would never break. But it was a Herculean effort. And it was like I said, a lot of it was technical and a lot of it was wet works, was going to the people and making sure that they had the tools in place to understand what was going to happen and what wasn't, and fix it. So, yeah.
Because I know you tried to get Skytown killed early on. You're like, nah, we shouldn't be doing this.
That's true. I love. Okay, so I've obviously listened to you interview all of my old friends before this, and yeah, I hated the idea of Skytown because, again, with the whole optimizing thing that I talked about, like Skytown was so by far the worst case. Like everything about Metroid was interiors, and those interiors were all fairly close to you, which meant pretty much we never needed, in fact, we never even had LODs for most of our enemies or environments by and large, because for any given room you were in or any given spot you were in, pretty much you couldn't see that far. You know, maybe one of the biggest examples would probably, or one of the biggest rooms in Prime 1 would have been like the main area of Fendrana Drifts, right? Where you go in and it's got the big... But if you actually look at the geo in there, there's not a lot going on in that area, you know, so we were able to sort of keep it down. But also, there's not a lot of, in a Metroid game, there's just not a lot of like layering of different things either, you know? So we're able to get that going. But with Skytown, like the whole idea of it is that you see the whole thing all the time, right? And you have these very massive chasms, and from one end to the other, you know, it's like a kilometer on those you know, on the zip lines and stuff. And so I wanted to get it killed, but actually, you know, the artist, and by the way, I was completely wrong, because Skytown is one of my favorite parts in all of the Prime games because of how different and amazing it is. But the artists and designers really stepped up and basically absorbed all of the info and things that I said were going to be a problem and fixed those things. They made all sorts of like fake Skytown pieces that were essentially LODs, but because of the way Skytown got cut up, you would never progress to that LOD without going through an interior area to see it again. So you see what I mean? So what would happen is like you'd be in like one area and you'd see way off in the distance a bunch of the other Skytown pods, and then you would go indoors, go through, come out the other end, and that's when the full one would be loaded in there. So Skytown ended up, because of my screaming and whining, Skytown got designed so that it could fit. Even though it looked all exterior, it was still a series of interior breakups between everything, if that makes sense. Yeah,
it does make sense. It's a interesting way of how to get around it, though. Yeah. It's tough because I think that, you know, like we had a lot of limitations based on memory for all of those games, and so the limitations really made us think outside the box for a lot of things. And I would say Skytown was probably one of the more painful of all of them, just because it was so different from everything else, really. Because you look at everything through a technical lens, and you have to, particularly with those games. Because I imagine in the meeting rooms, right, you've got all these animators and artists that are probably just thinking, oh, we should put this in the game and put that in the game. Or is there any times where you're just, besides from Skytown, where you're just like, no, we're not doing that. That is just not going to happen from a technically feasible standpoint?
I recall on Prime 2, I think it was Prime 2. It wasn't just me, but it was actually a number of the engineers. I think we killed water because basically, like, going underwater. It's one of the Prime games, either Prime 2 or Prime 3.
Because you go underwater in Prime 2, I think, in Torvus Bog.
Oh, you do? Yeah, you got Torvus Bog. Never mind. So it's Prime 3. I believe Prime 3 has no actual water. And so we basically killed that because I think someone wanted to put water in, going underwater in like one place in Prime 3 for one pickup. And we were just like, no, like there's no water in the rest of the game. So if there's no water, then we don't have to make a whole different locomotion system for the player.
Right.
You see?
I see.
And yeah, so there was that. And then I believe in I wanted, hey, gosh, I can't remember if it's Prime 2 or Prime 3. There was like one effect
I'll
that
probably
Tanabe
remember.
Yeah. Well, no, it might have been when you were walking in. Let's see here. So there was when you got the light suit in Prime 2, then suddenly you could go underwater in the dark areas, right? Like, wasn't there like this black,
Oh, yes,
opaque?
yes. Yep,
Yeah, it was like this black opaque goo, and then once you got the light suit, you could go in there basically. But prior to that, you couldn't do that. So I think Tanabe-san really wanted it to be that when that happened, that you actually like cut through the water, like basically like as you were standing on it or something, it would actually like goo up around you, and like it would sort of, and it was a cool idea for an effect. But it was just completely infeasible. And it was just like, this only happens at the end of the game. And doing this effect would affect frame rate. And I sort of walked him through the technical issues of doing that and got it killed. But it was one of the few times where like Tanabe-san came to my office. Like normally I never dealt with the Japanese designers all that much, other than surface level meetings and stuff like that. But this was one where he sort of came in like, I really want this. I'm told you're the one saying no, and you're going to tell me exactly why this is a no. And not in a mean way or anything. But then after we really talked through it, and after I walked him through the technical reasons, he actually had a good understanding, and we had that piece killed. So yeah, those are the two that I remember off the top of my head. Yeah, and the water thing was that was a group effort of getting that killed. Yeah.
Oh, they're small little minor things anyway. They're not something major like Skytown. So I don't think it's a major. I want to talk about Dark Aether because that is well known to have been a massive problem in terms of not, I suppose, realizing how much of a gargantuan task it was. In terms of, I suppose, from a project management standpoint and an engineer standpoint, were there just curveballs that you just didn't foresee?
Well, it's funny because seeing was actually the biggest problem with Dark Aether. Like visibility was huge, and so when it was first proposed, as has been mentioned in prior interviews, a big part of it was production savings, right? The idea being that we could take the same art assets in one and do it in the other.
Yeah.
So the first stab at that was actually that the first concepts had the dark world being like a lot darker. It was like black as night. And I remembered this, like the first concepts were essentially that you could barely see anything other than what was in the light bubbles. And the concepts had it so that everything was very blurry as it was far out, and then as it got closer in, it got a lot more clear. And so, like I remember one of the more striking concepts was one where there was like a light bubble and then like an ing in front of it. Remember the ings, the 5-legged horse guys? And the ing was like very blurry in front of the light bubble, and it had this very like sort of horror aspect to it. And then as things got closer in, they'd be clearer. And so the other idea was that essentially the world textures were going to be the same way. So you weren't really going to see much of the world outside, but as you got closer, it would almost become like the textures would still be from the same world, but they'd be like more like a mosaic. So think of it like when TV shows show someone suffering from like heat stroke or something, and everything looks palletized a little bit. That's kind of what it was sort of going for, was essentially that. But you think if you did that with like textures on the ground, then they would kind of look more like a mosaic, like if they were more palletized, if the color separations were bigger. And in the concepts, a lot of the time, the only light really came from Samus or from her morph ball. And so we actually had this thing where basically the light was essentially a spotlight that was like it was like a teardrop shaped spotlight that would come out of the front of Samus. And that's what she could kind of see. So the idea being that as you turned and looked, if there was like an ing in that teardrop, suddenly you would see him because he'd be black outside of it. And then as he got into that teardrop, you'd be able to see the enemy. and the enemy would try to sort of flee, or you would, shoot it and kill it or whatever. But that being said, and those were awesome concepts, I was able to get something that actually looked really similar to that, and it was impossible to play. Like, it destroyed platforming. You couldn't see where you were jumping. You couldn't see anything. And so suddenly, like, all of the levels that were built for the light world were impossible to move around in the dark world. So we spent a lot of time trying to make it work, and then it was clear that no matter what we tried to sort of slap onto it, like, it just wasn't going to happen. Like that aspect was not, we were not going to be able to share assets and have that same kind of thing. So it was at that point, I think, that essentially the artists also realized that if they wanted to do a dark world thing, they'd want to be able to customize things for the dark world. They didn't want to just like have it be some algorithmic, change of textures without any control on their end, which makes total sense. Like if you're an artist and your art is built for one lighting model and one thing, and by the way, Todd Keller is like one of the best lighting guys in the business in terms of art direction. He's not going to want something that is now, we're going to turn off the lights, make the main character spotlight, and destroy the resolution of all your textures for half the game. So all of that was sort of then scrapped, and Dark World became Purple World pretty much. And then and so we had some stuff to allow for automatic, texture, not mutilation, but text, like purplizing of things automatically, and then they could customize other stuff as they see fit. And so I think like the best way to see how that really works out is in Cliffside. What is Cliffside called in the shipping game? It's Sanctuary.
Sanctuary Fortress.
Sanctuary Fortress, right? The dark and light versions of that world, in my opinion, are amazing because it really shows if you build differently the lighting and texture models between both, how you could take the same area and make it look really cool but really different, but still know they're from the same core. Like that one, I think, was the one where the artists had the most time to really do more different, because by then I think some of the other areas like Ag and Waste and stuff had already had a lot built to it based on the old model. So a lot of it just kind of got like purplized and they moved forward. But for like Cliffside, for Sanctuary Fortress, I feel like that's the best use of saying, oh, look, we let the artists do different things in the different worlds. And that's why it looks so stunning to me, at least.
Yeah. I think the platforming is really well done in the games as well, because platforming is quite hard to do in first person. So was it your idea to kind of have the camera kind of move a little bit as you jump onto the different platforms?
It was not my idea. It was a design, man. Okay, so the people who primarily worked on that are the late Haigh Hutchinson, and
brilliant,
I believe it was. Yeah, it's so sad what happened to him. He passed away of pancreatic cancer, and very, very sudden, very, very sad. It was him, I believe. Carl Deckard and or Mark Pacini had worked on that, but that was, the platforming was actually something that took a ton of iteration in the first game, because I remember the first stab at that, because we always knew first person platforming was going to be a problem, like plain simple, always has been. I don't want to say always will be. People have come up with really good ways of solving for things, but yeah, the tipping down of the camera, it started actually as putting lock points in the platforms where you could actually like lock on to the middle of the platform and initiate the jump, and it would kind of auto jump you to the platform as like a helper,
oh, okay.
Yeah, like basically you could, with your visor, you'd see the places to be able to jump, lock on, initiate the jump, and then it would sort of autopilot you to that platform. That was the first iteration of it. It didn't feel great, obviously, but it definitely, I think, led to the right solution, which was essentially just that subtle camera tipping at the apex of the jump. Wasn't me. I believe Mark HH probably implemented it, and I think either Carl Deckard or Pacini were the ones that sort of iterated on that. But it was a brilliant solution and so simple. But like a lot of solutions in a lot of the games, it started out as something way overcomplicated and then just cut until you get to the important thing, which is really just the tipping down of the camera so you can see where you're going to land.
Was there any point that you remember specifically of something that just took so long to do? Like from an engineering standpoint? Like a lot of the Visor stuff, for example.
So the Visors, okay, so the Visors were actually mostly my baby, with the exception of the X-Ray Visor in Prime 1, which was done by Ted Chauvier, and most of the work of the Scan Visor in Prime 2, which was Jim Gage. I did much of the Visor stuff. The Visor stuff, let me think. So in the first game, we had Scan, we had Normal, we had
Scan, X-Ray, Thermal.
Thermal took a bunch of... Yeah, Thermal took a bunch of iteration. I'd also had bigger plans for Thermal. I actually gave the artist the ability to tag like any piece of static geometry as hot or cold. And part of me was hoping that they would take every little light thing and tag it as hot, so it would show up like the little like stand-up lights that were in Finjana Drifts and stuff. And I was so sad when they didn't do that. I mean, it's such a dumb thing. It's like such a dumb hill to die on, but like I was so annoyed. But I think I brought it up once and they very quickly dismissed me. Like, okay, thanks. We'll think about that. Thermal was a bit of a difficult one. I actually had to work back and forth with Carl Deckard on that a lot because we ended up making that, a palette swap. But I remember there's a decent amount of iteration on Thermal. For the second game, we had... So the Scan Visor in the second game was actually... And Jim Gage, like I said, did a lot of this. That was a tough one, because in the second game, we changed the Scan Visor from having the scan points
That's right.
to scanning anything on the character. And what that really ended up meaning was that we had to use the GPU and use readbacks from the GPU because we wanted it to be pixel perfect. So we'd render the character, we'd tag it in I forgot what they called it on the GameCube, but nowadays you'd call it a stencil buffer, and then we'd read that back when you tried to initiate a scan to see what was under your scan reticle. But then we had to do all this stuff, like if you're drawing translucent stuff over something over something opaque, then can you scan through that translucent thing, and just all sorts of other stuff like that. It got very a lot of jiggery pokery was put in there. Like I think we had to put in some fake things of like, well, if you're also near this box, then you can scan it, because like objects being too small to scan, stuff like that. So that was a pretty big technical one. The Dark Visor in Prime 2, I remember Mike Kelbaugh really hated it. He did not like what I came up with because he thought it looked very 16-bit. Michael Kelbaugh was the new president of Nintendo. Yeah. And he had been there since time immemorial. So, he had he has a very good remembrance of what 16-bit looks like. And I did this thing of like trails, but he thought the trails looked 16-bit, which I kind of did on purpose, but he didn't like that. And then the Echo Visor in Prime 2, that was a tough one. Oh, thank you very much.
Solid Visor, though. Amazing Visor.
Yeah, that one was very heavily inspired. It's probably the only good thing that came out of the first Daredevil movie with Ben Affleck. Okay. Yeah. That was heavily inspired. That was heavily inspired by that movie, actually. That one was a fun one. I really liked that Visor because it was so different. It wasn't like Dark Visor was just like a different spin on X-ray / thermal, right? It was just like another way to see hidden stuff. Yeah. But the Echo was a really fun one to work on. That was tough. Probably the hardest thing about the Visors, honestly, was keeping 60 FPS for every Visor. And because basically you've got 4 different ways of viewing the world in every game, and all of those have to run at 60.
Yeah. So is it, I mean, obviously it's not as simple as just writing a piece of code, or there's obviously some pretty big technical hurdles.
Yeah. Like the bloom lighting in Prime 3 let us get away with a lot, because actually after Prime 2, Mark Pacini wanted the scan visor in Prime 3 to outline everything instead of just having the sort of solid blocks for everything. Right. Remember in Prime 2, you would scan something and it would just be a big blob of color, essentially, with like interlace lines between it, right?
Yeah.
Like it was, in Prime 3, everything was actually nicely outlined. But what's funny is, since we were using bloom lighting in Prime 3, bloom lighting is actually a very soft outline. You essentially take the brightness of the screen and you blur it in 8 directions, and then that's how you get bloom lighting.
Ah, is that it?
So
is that how you do it?
That's really it. You take what's on the screen, you find the brightest bits, you sort of just isolate those as the brightest, and then you just draw it low resolution 8 times or whatever, and blurry, and then that's how you get bloom lighting. So you take the brightest parts and you blur the brightest parts over the screen. There's your bloom lighting, right?
Right.
So for outlines in the scan visor in Prime 3, all I had to do was take away the bloom lighting and then just do it all to 1 pixel, and then blur it all to 1 pixel around, and then I got outlines.
So how much time does that save?
No, it's not about save. It's equal. So
right.
that's the thing about dealing with the visors in all the games, is how do I get rid of enough information from the main world in order to draw the stuff on the visor? And basically looking at the GPU usage of all of that and making sure that I can. So,
with the Nova Beam, when you lock on, it kind of goes into like super, super detailed of the enemy in Prime 3, I think it is. So yep. Were you in charge of that as well, in terms of how it zooms in when you lock on?
No, I didn't actually. I don't remember who did that. That wasn't me. But I mean, I believe most of that was actually like UI work more than anything else.
Right.
Like, I don't actually think that it re-rendered the whole scene when you zoomed in like that. I believe that the zoom was a pixel zoom, so it was like, like a digital zoom rather than an optical zoom. I don't believe it re-rendered the scene. I think it actually just grabbed the scene, zoomed it, and then drew the UI reticles on top of it. So that's actually not a big deal in terms of GPU usage. So I think it was basically just doing like a snapshot, enlarging the snapshot a little bit, and then drawing the things on top. I believe I didn't do the Nova Beam. I don't remember who did the Nova Beam stuff, but yeah, I think most of that was actually a UI thing. I don't think that really had too much performance impact.
There's still a lot of subtle effects that the Prime games have that a lot of first-person shooters still don't do, like just in terms of like Samus's reflection, or steam hitting the visor, water hitting the visor. I mean, it was truly ahead of its time. And even in Prime 3, as she becomes more corrupted and you're scanning, you can see the outlines of phase-on and stuff. How much does that actually affect the streaming ability and keeping a stable frame rate?
Oh,
or is it really minor stuff?
That's actually pretty minor stuff. So the GameCube had and Wii, since the Wii was the similar architecture to the GameCube, they had a very, very good GPU in terms of overdraw. So you could actually draw decent amounts of particle effects and overdrawn particle effects, as long as the things you were drawing were relatively simple. So as long as they weren't like bump mapped or lit meaningfully, like specular lighting. Do you know what specular lighting is?
Well, best to explain, because I'm sure there's people that will be like, What is that? Yeah.
So, yeah, that's true. I guess I am talking to more than just you. At the very simplest, especially for those architectures back then, diffuse lighting is where you have a very flat object. Think of it like just like a piece of paper, has no reflections on it. You have flat lighting. The calculations for that are simplistic. It's just basically distance from the lighting, distance from the light, and some attenuation, some fall off. times the color. That's
right.
pretty much diffuse lighting. Very, very simplistic for a GPU to do that. For specular lighting, specular is when you have something that's reflective, like my glasses here, right? You know, they reflect light. And in the real world, that reflection is actually a pure reflection of there. But what they did in classical graphics is they just would approximate it. So you'd have a light source, and the specular light, it would look at the bounce between the surface and the camera. And so that's why, like, when you move around the camera, you see the lighting change. With diffuse, it doesn't change no matter which way you're looking with the camera. Specular lighting on the GameCube was a very expensive operation, whereas diffuse lighting was very cheap for dynamic lights. So, like I said, we would avoid that kind of thing, and we'd avoid bump mapping. So when we had our visor effects, like things like the steam and all of that, most of the opacity of those was really determined by game events, and then the steam itself was just like a couple of layers of textures, but they weren't lit meaningfully or anything like that. So it was actually really cheap to draw them. Same with Samus's face. So when we drew the reflection of Samus's face, it was just a single light source model with one diffuse texture, no reflection, no nothing. That was just drawn like as an additive thing, you know, over the face. So it was about as simple of a type of thing you could draw. But that's what's nice about it, right? Is like you'd see it and it would give you so much, it would have such an impact whenever you saw it. It connected you. And that, I believe that might have been Chris Volman's idea to do that. And in the first game, it actually happened whenever you fired the super missile. So in Prime 1, you would actually see Samus's reflection when she fired the super missile or when it exploded in her face or whatever. And then, yeah, we just in the subsequent Prime games just wanted to find excuses to show it more and more because it was such a cool thing and connected you with the character so much. I mean, everything about the visor design, in my opinion, was just completely brilliant and game changing. And I absolutely love everything about it. But what was also nice was a lot of the stuff with it didn't have a lot of performance concerns at all. In fact, I will say, like, the one environmental effect that, now that I think about it, almost had a bad performance concern, but we fixed it, was Prime 2. When you start out and you go in the fog and all those, like, zombie...
Federation Marines.
Yeah, the Federation Marines. And it's really foggy down there, and it's just, like, green fog. But what's funny is that green fog is actually just 3 texture cards, and I'm just sort of scrolling them and scaling them in and out constantly, so it looks like a room full of fog, but it's really just 3 passes of textures. So that we could...
Nobody would pick up on that. Nobody would pick up on that.
Nobody, but that's why it ran at 60. Because if it was traditional, like just place fog volumes all over the place, then, you know, which is how it was originally spec'd out, then it would have, you know, just ran like garbage. So, yeah.
So I want to get some clarification on this. So just correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, so from what I understand is Nintendo always wanted the Metroid Prime games to be in first person, primarily because Metroid is a Western franchise, and Western developers are better at first person shooters than Japanese developers, right? That's right. It was never intended to be a third person shooter, was it?
Nintendo did not intend it to be a third-person shooter. When we did our first prototypes, we did do them as third-person. But, I mean, these were the initial, like, getting streaming working and stuff. I believe they might have seen that. We had, like, basically a third-person Samus kind of running around between doors, and then they immediately put the kibosh on it. We're like, no. We said first person, we meant first person. But from Nintendo's side of things, 100% of the reason we got it is because, and this is apocryphal, I heard it through people there, was essentially that Metroid was not all that popular in Japan, but every time Miyamoto came to the West in the N64 era, people in North America were just constantly barraging him with questions about when a Metroid was going to come out on the N64. And so that showed him that the Westerners cared about the game a lot more than the Japanese. And so then they wanted to put that sort of Western sensibility on it. But I know even when we first got the IP, people, even in our studio, thought that that was not the right move, and sort of buckled against it for a little bit. But then we kind of figured it out, mainly because of the Morph Ball. The Morph Ball was a big outlier of like, how do we do this? How do we do Morph Ball with first person? And that we did it in third person, which again was Mark HH, him doing the camera stuff for that and making that happen with other folks, to get like the Morph Ball motion working. A former employee named Scott Johnson did a lot on that as well. But just making the Morph Ball cameras work is such a gargantuan impact, and something that honestly I wish Mark HH would get more kudos and credit for, because the amount of innovative things and the amount of work he put into that, and the fact that nobody complains about that camera, is incredible.
So the R.U.D.E engine, who was actually in charge of creating the R.U.D.E engine?
Okay, so for one thing, R.U.D.E actually stands for Retro Unified Development Environment. So retro,
good acronym for it.
Yeah, and the reason it was is because Retro used to be 4 teams. Used to have over 100. I think I was like employee 120 or something crazy like that. There were 4 teams that got whittled down to 2 teams that got whittled down to 1 team. Is what happened with Retro. But something about the engine that I don't think a lot of people really understand is a pretty stunning amount of engineers actually worked on it for a very long time. And even when I got to Retro, this is before we had real GameCube hardware. I think maybe one person had like a very old GameCube prototype. This is before the studio got dev units at large. And there had already been written a stunning amount of like core code for games without really games running on them. I remember, when I got to Retro, there were 4 projects. There were Car Combat, NFL, Metaforce, which became Metroid, and Raven Blade. And like my first assignment, I was in the tools and technology team at the time, was to write a renderer for the football games stadiums. So like some people had built stadium models, and there had not been a renderer. So I remember I like wrote something to chop up the stadiums into what seemed like meaningfully small chunks, and then like did something where like if you made a player run over it, it would like put footsteps in the mud, stuff like that. But we were still doing it all on like GeForce hardware or whatever. But I remember that the engine had a full math library. It had a full, for C++ nerds, STL. Like STL is this core library for C++. For someone at Retro rewrote it and called it RSTL. Had that completely written. Had like full like collision and primitives, and you could like collide a box with a box and get the whole collision volume. It had the underpinnings of like the streaming system that eventually got done in there, but it did have the underpinnings of like tracking objects and when they went away, and marking them as loading. It had like a ridiculous amount of code already written there. And so when I got there, they had been sort of starting on this kind of unified world editor. They had this environment where essentially it was just like, think of it like a Windows taskbar and then menus for different editors and stuff. And each game could like register which editors they wanted to use or not. So it'd be like, start the particle editor, start the world editor, start, whatever, all inside this sort of like taskbar type thing. And they still didn't have a world editor then. And I remembered when I got there, they started having all these meetings about like, well, how are we going to build out the scenes and the worlds? And what are we going to call things? We have actors and entities, but that's not descriptive. And then someone, I remember it's one of the dumbest things I'd ever heard. Someone was like, why don't we call entities that have positions ducks? We're like, ducks? Like, yeah, ducks. I'm like, all right, great. So anyway, some people went off and wrote a world editor. I immediately started writing World Editor 2. because World Editor 1 was made more out of meetings than code. And so and then a lot of the design principles just weren't working. So World Editor 1 was being used by, I believe, Raven Blade and Football. And then I just wrote World Editor 2 for Metroid. And that World Editor 2 ended up being what we kept doing. So basically, the R.U.D.E sort of shell still remained there. But I wrote World Editor. The late Andy O'Neill wrote the particle editor and all of the particle systems underneath it. And then a fellow named Kai Martin wrote the animation editor. And then also Alex Quinones. A lot of people sort of contributed. But I think one thing that a lot of people don't really understand is Retro actually had years of code written before all of the hacks and slashes of the projects happened. So when you ask who's responsible, it's dozens and dozens of people. A lot of their contributions have gone unheard, but honestly, it's one of the reasons we were able to race so fast once we did get dev kits, is because we had this whole engine underpinning already written. We didn't have the game engine, but we had the math, the primitives, all of that stuff kind of there enough to be able to write the game engine on top of it.
So when you were making the first original Metroid Prime, when did you know that you kind of nailed it, right? Because there was so much controversy with that game. I would have hated to have been one of you guys in this day and age during social media. It would have been hell, I'm sure. It would have been hell, I'm sure. But because I know you kind of had a middle finger to the haters mentality as you were doing it. And you guys were just all determined to make the best product possible. But when did you kind of feel that you'd actually really nailed it?
Two times for me. One was E3. When we did that E3 build, where we sort of came out, just even playing that build was oh wow, we've done something here. And then after that E3 happened and we got all sorts of positive coverage and everything, that was probably the moment where everybody on the team, well, I can't speak for them, I can speak for myself, I felt oh, we need to really finish this because this is something special. Not just something special we think it's good, oh, this is connecting with people really, really see this. We were nearly done with it by that point, I think, anyway. To be completely honest, my brain is a blur for finishing out that project. It was ridiculous. With how old I am now, I couldn't have worked the amount I worked on that project and the time and everything like that. But there was that. And then the other one was actually, for me, was when we were in what's called lot check, which is, when Nintendo is doing certification and stuff. And so when you're in lot check, you really don't have that much to do during the day as an engineer, other than just sort of wait to be told that something failed, that you missed, oh, if someone hit the reset button while they were ejecting the disk, they didn't get an error. That's real, by the way. Wow. It was frustrating. But so I was playing the game and I realized that while I was waiting for lot check, I had played through the game 3 times and loved it. I had played 3 9-hour long sessions of the game. And that was actually the first time that I'd seen a lot of the game, because I've seen the whole game, but never linked together, or I would see areas as we went into reviews and stuff like that, but I wouldn't have necessarily always seen how the enemies were laid out and how all of that's done. And so I remembered specifically when we were in the mine. So remember in the mines in
Phase on
Prime
mines.
1. Yeah, the phase on mines. Yeah, those mines. The space pirates that came out that were only vulnerable to a certain beam.
Yes.
I loved that, and I had known about those guys, but it didn't click until I played it, and I'm oh my god, this is such brilliant pacing. Like, in fact, that was the thing about Prime 1, is how brilliant the pacing in that game was. And so that when I played through it and I realized I played through it 3 times and enjoyed all 3 playthroughs, then I'm like, oh, this is the real deal. It made me so happy. It made me so happy to have that realization near the end of the game.
As a creative person, because I understand you have to constantly be challenged and you're always looking to new horizons. And I know even with this show, like if I was to interview every person from Retro, I think for like 8 months, I think I'd probably start to get fatigued in terms of like talking about it all the time. But you worked on the Metroid Prime Trilogy for what, 8 years? Was it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 8 years.
How did you continue to maintain that energy and still have that, that passion for it?
Well,
without getting fatigued, like just like, oh, kind of over this.
I was young for one thing, that helped, but that's why I left after Prime 3 though. I was fatigued, not of I was sort of fatigued of Metroid, but yeah, it was largely why I ended up leaving Retro after Prime 3. Was because of that. By the end of Prime 3, I really enjoyed it, but Retro had hit a place where I think everybody either didn't want to work on another Prime or knew that going through that road again was going to be bad, mentally. And and so that, keeping that going for 8 years wasn't that hard. And I, like, honestly, when the Wii came out, on a technical side of things, I was a little disappointed in it. And that might have also led to some of that fatigue. I really wanted to work on really cool things. And I think Brian Walker mentioned it in your interview with him.
Yeah.
Me getting my ass handed to me by Takeda-san. But part of that really did stick with me about like that technically staying with Nintendo was going to mean staying a bit in a box and a bit behind. And so creatively, that as an engineer, that was a creative problem for me. It was hard to justify that, and like it's easy to work in a box. It's easy to work in that, but when it's that same box, and again, like the Wii is fundamentally this very similar hardware to the GameCube.
Yeah.
Now, the controller stuff and everything, that was really cool and innovative, but I'm not a gameplay programmer. I'm not. Yeah. I don't really do all that much in terms of gameplay. The closest I get to gameplay is working on the Visors. And so for me creatively, it really did kind of sting a little bit that on Prime 3, I personally was very excited, and I know some other people were too, to like work on what would have been next generation hardware. And then when that was sort of pulled out, obviously Prime 3 was going to be finished, but I didn't have that much of a desire to keep working on the Wii after that for very long. And so that is one of the reasons I left.
Well, the reason why I bring it up is because all 3 games are quite distinctive. Mm-hmm. Like you still manage to find ways of being creative, right? I mean, I think sometimes fan bases of any, and I know this happens with Metroid because I've seen it, where everyone holds up Super Metroid as like the GOAT, and everything gets compared to that, right? But from a creative standpoint, you wouldn't want to just make Super Metroid 2.0 because you want to try new things and experiment with new things. So it's great what you guys did on all 3 games in order to make them all different.
Yeah, I would say creatively that Metroid Prime 2 as a project was a strange one because it went through a lot of, well, one, it came, after, at Retro, it came after, they basically sort of turned over the tea table, brought in Michael Kelbaugh, and Brian Walker and all of those folks to sort of restructure upper management. And so while game-wise, you could say that's not a game creative thing, it was a real breath that all of us needed to have that support of now being really part of the Nintendo family. Because prior to that, we sort of were this separate group of people. And I would say that that probably was a giant good kick in the pants that kept everybody going after Prime 1. And so I think that helped creatively, because it also brought us closer to Japan and made everyone feel like they were more part of Nintendo. Like before Prime 2, we were retro. Before Prime 1 shipped, we were retro. After Prime 1, we were Nintendo. We were still retro, but we were Nintendo. And then after Prime 2, so Prime 2 was still kind of divisive. You know, there was sort of the multiplayer stuff, which I've spoken about before, and some of the false starts with the Dark Light World thing. But then when Prime 3 happened, I felt like we were sort of given not more autonomy necessarily, but we were sort of like given the keys back of like, you guys are single player only. We are just going to plow on this, and you're going to be a showcase for the new hardware. And I think that was also creatively like something that that really helped people and really moved people forward. And so I think it was that coupled with that we could do a lot of different stuff, but I would say that a decent amount of stuff happening underneath the games is actually what kept a lot of people going.
Well, that makes sense, though. Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Because you need that stuff.
Yeah. And like showcasing for the Wii, that is cool. Like, I mean, like I said, I was underwhelmed with what the actual hardware was, but like, I mean, that thing was also such a cultural milestone and everything too, and the Wii. And so,
oh, yeah, for sure.
So that was fun, but yeah.
So when you formed Armature Studios, was there any part of you that kind of, because obviously you've worked under Nintendo for so long, was there kind of things you took for granted and didn't realize initially when you started your own studio? And it's like, actually, we kind of took some of this mentorship for granted.
Oh, one of them is naming it Armature. And then the first time I went to ship a package, someone went, "Oh, you're with Armature Studios?" I was like, "Oh, no." We made a huge mistake.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, there's a number of things that we took them for granted, but yes. So there's a number of things. One is something that has been touched on before, which is the fact that one is once you leave a really marquee studio and you go out on your own, a lot of things get completely reset. So, for instance, a lot of it's smart. Like if there's just like 3 of you at a studio and you're trying to pitch a game and they're like, "Great, so who's your team going to be?" And we're like, "Oh, we'll find a team." And they're like, "Yeah, but what about those old retro people?" We're like, "Well, we can't poach all of retro." They'd be like, "Okay, well, let us know when you have a team." So suddenly then it becomes from starting a studio to starting a team. And in our case, we when we started, we had announced that we had a partnership with Electronic Arts. And then like within days of us starting, the people that forged this partnership with us left Electronic Arts. And so suddenly we had lost, I know, it was awful. And so we lost our champions. And then, come 6 months later, I believe at that point, we divested the relationship with Electronic Arts and went out and started farming ourselves out. We were able to find a lot of things because of our past, but like I will say that there is Nintendo's way of giving developers, it's something Mark Pacini liked to say a lot, which was freedom to fail, giving them that ability to figure things out and to work through problems, even if it meant spending some money or being late. As long as you could show that you're being thoughtful, Nintendo let you do what you needed to do to get things done. Again, as long as you're smart and as long as you're thoughtful. It's oftentimes not like that with a lot of folks in the West. A lot of the time, it's you have to put like a huge amount of upfront documentation. You have to pre-think a lot of things, even though they're things that you really need to prototype. You need to work out. But prototyping costs money, and figuring things out costs time and money. And so you end up having to sort of make these pitch documents and these grandiose salesy things that are ultimately salesy and aren't going to be discovered until the process is there. And so that was a very, very difficult thing. And a lot of like the business development and stuff actually fell on my shoulders during the Armature stuff. And it was fascinating because I saw inside of it and I saw how the financials work. And to be completely honest, like the way that a lot of this industry is sort of financed and the way pitches go forward, you kind of have to fake it till you make it, or you have to have the capital to be able to burn through prototyping before someone will give you money. And it was a very, very difficult thing to go through.
Because I find it bizarre. I mean, Mike Wicken touched on this as well, but like I would think because video games are an interactive medium, that prototyping would be the way to go as opposed to a massive pitch document.
It's not just massive pitch documents, but like, for instance, a lot of the way the deals get structured is that they want, when you're going to do a prototype, they want to do an entire long form agreement of the entire game, get that done with their legal departments to make sure that the game is going to happen before you start the prototype. And so what that ends up doing is it ends up negating a lot of what you're doing in the prototype anyway, because you still have to figure out how much the whole thing is going to cost for this thing that you really don't know that much about. Again, unless you do all this upfront prototyping work, which is money that you ultimately never recoup or almost never recoup. Because the way financing is done in video games for any independent developer is essentially, it's like a book deal. You're borrowing against royalties that you may or may not make. And so if you borrow, if it costs you, say, I'm just throwing bad numbers. If you borrowed like $1,000 to make your game, and then your game only makes $300, you still get your $1,000, right? But that borrowing starts when the contract with the publisher starts. So if you do a bunch of prototyping up front and then bring that prototype to a publisher, whatever you've spent on that prototype will only come out of profits that you get. But because, I'm just going to throw a number out there. Let's say that your royalty is 20%. You spend $1,000 on the game, you have to make $5,000 before you see one more dollar in profit. And only then that's when you can start to pay off your prototype phase.
Right. Has that become a bit...
So does it make sense to make a prototype? If there's a chance your game won't make money, then you'll never get paid back for that prototype.
Okay. But then why
if you make it on your own dime.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, that's all right. But then why would Nintendo do it that way? Because obviously they must be doing something right if that's the way they look at it, if they're all about prototypes.
Because they know that that's the right way to go. Like it's all about risk reward, and it's about where you put your risk and where you see your reward, right? And so for one thing, most of Nintendo's teams are internal, and so they're kind of seeing a lot of that as sunk costs anyway, right?
Yeah,
but
true.
But they do it that way, but it's also just, I think, a Western way of doing business is almost, it's one of not trusting the other party by default, right?
Yeah.
Is like saying like, well, but what if you did this prototype and then you got another deal and walked away from us? Then we're just stuck with a prototype and we'd have to find another team. But you guys have special stuff. Like, these are the kinds of things I heard. Like, I'm not making this up. Like, these are the fears that they have in the West of doing business. Of like, well, if we pay you to do a prototype, but then you walk after the prototype, we're stuck. So we need to do a whole long form agreement. But then, and if we do this long form agreement, it's good for you, except for all the places where we can terminate the agreement and get out of it. You know, it's such a different way of where you mitigate risk and where you look at risk. And I think that, like, you know, especially it's just a very different way of doing business, Japanese versus Western. Is, you know, doing business with Japanese is a lot more handshaky. It's a lot more have a drink with the guy and or gal and trust than it is worrying and wrangling your hands around legal documents. Like, I dealt with Capcom, I dealt with Konami, I dealt with a lot of Japanese companies also when I was with Armature, and it felt like being at home working with them in a lot of ways, even though, you know, the Capcom thing didn't end up ultimately working out. It still felt more right because there was more of a personal stake. Like, the contracts were like a tenth the size that they were in the West, you know, and if we needed to justify doing something different, we could do it, you know, and it was definitely just a different mentality. And so I think when your approach to doing business is initially one of distrust and one of risk mitigation, but you see the risk not as, is the product going to be good, but are we going to finish the product, then that's a problem.
Is that changing at all, or has that just been the same like the whole way through?
Nope.
Is it just some tradition that's just stuck around?
All 8 years that I was at Armature, it was there that way until I left.
I'm not even a game designer, and I find that frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, it was something that I very much did not enjoy. I didn't understand. I tried to buck against it as much as I could, but it just it's hard. It's very hard, and to see it continue to happen over and over, it's frustrating. And it is something that I think I did take for granted at Nintendo, because I think, like, when we left, we maybe thought we could bring the Nintendo way of making games to the rest of the West. But I think what ended up happening is that, unfortunately, the West was kind of brought to us, because it's just not something, you know, it's not something people are ready to do. And they'll say they'll be like, oh yeah, we're a publisher, we operate totally differently, but then they don't, you know, and that's the unfortunate truth. Anyone that does, which I know there's a handful out there, but anyone that does, I think that they are the people to work with. And I think that they're the ones that are going to be making the great games. And it's a very difficult balancing act. And people have found success in this system, and people have found ways to work within it and get it going. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's definitely different, and it's not changing all that much. Yeah.
Well, I'd imagine it would trickle down as well. It would start to trickle down within the actual quality of a game, just from that starting point. Just from that, the fact that you're dealing with pitch documents, I mean, it would get tedious and all that as well, with all the documentation and the legal stuff, before you've even done anything in terms of the design stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we would do design. Yeah, we would do design for the pitch documentation, but really, like, I mean, design documents are, you know, like 10 pounds of design documents are worth the paper they're on. Like, you know, they're not. Anyone can design a game. Not a lot of people can build a game, you know, and anyone can build something, but there's just, you know that triangle, the what is it, cheap, fast, good, pick two.
Oh yes.
Yeah, like fast, you just need time, and time doesn't necessarily mean 5 years. Time just means the ability to try something, fail at it, try it again, and whittle it to a place it needs to go. And you can still have a short timeline. I mean, the Metroid games only had like 1.5 2 year timelines, but that's because we just really picked our battles really well. And we knew what we were going to do and what we were going to be good at. And we just barreled through that, you know, and just did that. I mean, we also had like the most talented group of people I will ever work with. But like, we also knew to just laser focus on the things that we needed to focus on and just polish. And everyone says that. Like, everyone says you need this. You need time to polish. You need to do it. But a lot of people don't get it. And that's just the unfortunate truth of the matter.
Yeah, yep. And you still continue to see it. I mean, the whole GTA thing that just released, the GTA trilogy.
Yeah. Oh gosh.
Perfect example. Yeah.
all those remasters. It's really funny because, like, you know, not to move to Bluepoint. I mean, I am very good friends with, you know, well, and again, the late Andy O'Neill, and Marco Thrush, who founded Bluepoint, and you know, I ended up doing contracting with them on Shadow of the Colossus and on Demon's Souls after I left Armature, and they are so good at remasters, so ridiculously good. They also, you know, aren't cheap, but it's because they are so ridiculously good. And then you see these other remasters come out where you can just tell that the love wasn't put into the remaster in the way that it needed to be put out, you know, and you find all the, you know, I'm not going to name names because that's just mean, but it strikes me as so funny because, like, I've been part of a lot of the Bluepoint remasters and seeing what they do, and it's not rocket science, but it is care. It's so much of it is just making sure that you honor it and then put on top of that this awesome other stuff. And it stuns me to see that people can't even take something that's already been designed and make it, you know, amazing. So yeah, that's it's funny seeing even things like that get just mismanaged. And yeah. on a downer.
Oh yeah, I don't want to keep you going for too long. So, although I will finish with a plug for your wife, because she does some amazing recipes that I've tried myself. So I highly recommend, even if you're not into vegetarian food and vegan food, I highly suggest trying that stuff out. Do you miss the game development side, or do you like being involved in the food industry?
No. So my wife, by the way, she has a number of cookbooks, and her handle on Instagram is Love and Lemons.
Yep.
And also the website loveandlemons.com. I mean, I miss the game stuff, definitely. But I've been enjoying branching out and trying other things as well. You know, I actually did do some contracting for some friends of mine last year on a prototype that didn't end up moving forward, but it was very fun. And so I was able to do that during some of the pandemic and everything like that. But I miss the game stuff. I don't miss running a company right now, to be completely honest. But I think I think I'll get back into the game stuff, definitely. You know, me and my wife just had a child 6 months ago, and so that's also been my life. But yeah, no, I miss the game stuff. I miss the collaboration. I miss a lot of that. And actually, during a lot of the pandemic was when I was working on Demon's Souls with Bluepoint, and that was really, really, really fun. You know, I miss all of that stuff. I miss working with and talking to smart people all the time. That's something I honestly really miss.
Well, I'm sorry I'm not up to the intelligence level of some of them.
But no, of course you are. No, I mean, it's...
You have to make two of me with a hobbit from New Zealand, but it's okay. So if anyone wants to follow you and keep up to date with what you're doing, what's the best way for them to do that?
I guess Jack_Mathews and Twitter, I suppose. I haven't really kept up much of a social media presence. Pretty much most of my Twitter stuff lately has been trying to help the people that are working on the Prime World Editor project, trying to remember code I wrote 20 years ago,
right,
to help them out. But yeah, you can follow me on there. And then, yeah, I highly ask that people buy everything my wife has made on Love and Lemons and cook her food, because it's incredible.
I agree. Give her my regards. Oh, and also, just because we talked about this off air, is you posted a tweet ages ago about your Metroid Prime 2 plaque falling off and cracking, and then people took that and think that you hate Metroid Prime 2 as a result, which is not the case, right? You're clarifying that right now.
No. I do not hate Metroid Prime 2.
There you go.
That was just a dumb joke, and then I forgot I was on the internet. So but yes, in fact, if I hated it, I would not have the plaque right there.
There you go.
And actually, the nice thing about the glass not being on there is it doesn't have the glare that all the other guys have now. So, you would almost think, and also, I just put this wall up because I just moved recently, and I honestly thought that my head was going to be more in the bottom of the frame, so I thought you'd be able to see it more. So that's probably just going to add even more to the internet controversy of Metroid Prime 2 hate gate or whatever.
I might have to go online and be like, no, it's not the case. I might just have to keep telling everybody. But it's okay. No. But hey, thank you so much for taking the time out and doing this. I know things are crazy for you at the moment, particularly being a father. So I very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much. This was really fun. I enjoyed it.
All right. Well, that's the show, everyone. Make sure you share, like, and subscribe. And until next time, stay safe.